You say at home, Israel has a robust democracy that gives more rights to Arab citizens than its neighbors do. This was, after all, a war with Gaza. Thank God Israel treats its Arab citizens better than Egypt, Syria, or Saudi Arabia treat their Arab citizens. I didn't see much of that in the press, so I was glad to see you say it. Can you put some bones on that? Why do you say they treat their citizens better, their Arab citizens?
So, I also said a lot more, and
This was the start of Bill Maher's 9-minute segment on Israel-Palestine, which began with this quote from Nicholas Kristof's May 19th op-ed in the New York Times. Nicholas Kristof is totally awestruck by the question. In fact, he almost seems to be laughing at how Bill Maher completely misrepresents his piece. In the piece, he argues that if Hamas and Israel are both committing war crimes, why does the U.S. continue to support Israel with our tax dollars and our UN veto power? That was the point of the piece. And the sentence quoted by Bill Maher was itself tangential to the point of the article. And when taken out of context, it's a gross misrepresentation of Kristof's point. Bill Maher, A+ in intellectual dishonesty.
I would submit that Israel did not steal anybody's land. This is another thing I've heard the last couple of weeks, words like occupiers.
This is the first time you are hearing of the phrase occupier? Dude, have you been living in a cocoon for the past 54 years? The Israeli military occupied the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza in 1967. It's called a military occupation because since 1967, the Israeli military makes all the critical decisions in the occupied territories. Who can install a water pump? Who can build a home? Who can assemble a group of 10 people for a political purpose? Who's allowed to protest? When? Where? And why? Who can access the aquifers beneath the ground? Who gets to fish in the Mediterranean Sea? Who gets to enter and exit? Who gets to make green, red, and black artwork? It's the Israeli military that decides who gets to wave flags, what gets published in Palestinian textbooks and magazines, who Palestinians are allowed to marry, whether or not they can travel from Nablus to Hebron, and who gets to visit the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's the Israeli military that decided to ban the word Palestine in occupied Palestine. It got brought up. The Israeli military makes the rules. That's why we use the term occupier.
The Jews have been in that area of the world since about 1200 BC, way before the first Muslim or Arab walked the earth, 1,000 years before. I mean, Jerusalem was their capital. The Jews were the ones who were occupied by everybody. The Romans took over at some point, and then the Persians and the Byzantines and then the Ottomans.
Okay, Bill, here is the problem with your argument. Your argument is that it's not a military occupation because the Jews have lived in this land for 3,000 years. What you are saying, in other words, is that to solve the military occupations of the world, all you need to do is investigate the ancient ethno-religious history of those occupied lands. All you have to do is figure out who was there first thousands of years ago, and all the world's military occupations are going to get resolved. Bill, ancient history, medieval history, early modern history is irrelevant to resolving the military occupations of the world. The way to resolve a military occupation starts with asking the people living under military occupation, what kind of government do you want? If you want to figure out who has the legitimate right to rule in Ramallah or Gaza or Nablus, you cannot consult a professor of ancient Near Eastern studies at Hillbilly Bumfuck University, Bill Maher. You have to consult the people living in Ramallah, living in Nablus, living in Gaza, and ask them who has a legitimate right to rule.
Beginning in the 20th, 19th century, they started to return to Palestine, which was never an Arab country. There was never a country called Palestine that was a distinct Arab country. And yes, there was a problem there because there was two people who wanted to share the land, which is why the UN in 1947 said, okay, we're going to partition it.
First of all, I love it that Bill Maher is now a big believer in the UN, even though up until about 2 minutes ago, this guy didn't even acknowledge Israel's military occupation. Bill, do you know what the UN calls the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza? They call it the OPT, which stands for the Occupied Palestinian Territories. Bill, you just tried to summarize the history of Israel-Palestine in the first half of the 20th century without mentioning British colonial rule from 1917 to 1948. Dude, it was because of British colonial rule that we have this seemingly never-ending conflict in the first place. It was because the British supported Jewish immigration, Jewish land purchases in Palestine, despite the fact that these things violated the political will of 85% of the population. Remember, shortly after the British took over Palestine in 1917, the people of the region were surveyed. They were asked, do you support establishing a Jewish national homeland, a national homeland for the Jews in Palestine? 5.7% said yes, 85% no. The British were like, yeah, let's go with the 5.7%. And so over the course of the next 30 years, the British facilitated Jewish immigration and Jewish land purchases in Palestine in direct violation of the will of the Palestinians. And this led to conflict. It led to resistance.
The two-state solution has been on the table a number of times. There could be an Arab capital in East Jerusalem now if Yasser Arafat had accepted that in 2003. He did not. I mean, they have rejected this and went to war time and time again.
If you really want to talk about the 2000 Camp David Accords, let's talk about it. I'm down. I like talking about it. The first major problem, of course, was that Yasser Arafat didn't represent the Palestinian people. He didn't represent Palestinian refugees abroad. He didn't represent Hamas, of course. And so if you're Israel and you're dividing and ruling the Palestinians into Palestinians in Israel, in East Jerusalem, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in refugees abroad, you've created 4 or 5 different Palestinian constituencies that you need to negotiate with. And yeah, obviously that's going to make it a lot harder. So what happened at the negotiating table in 2000? First of all, everything was oral. There were no written documents produced from these meetings, which, by the way, some people have interpreted to mean that there was no offer made at all in 2000. But let's just say that an oral offer counts as an offer. On Jerusalem, Israeli and Palestinian positions were actually close enough to compromise on. But the problem was the rest of the West Bank. Israel offered a Palestinian state in Gaza and 80% of the West Bank, which meant that 10% was going to get annexed to Israel for the settlements, and 10% would become an Israeli-controlled security zone in the Jordan Valley. Plus, Israel got to control the airspace, the groundwater, 3 small military outposts in the West Bank. Israel also reserved the right to deploy the Israeli military in the West Bank in case of emergency, a phrase not precisely defined because this was all oral. Plus, Israel had no plans to make the Palestinian state contiguous, i.e. to allow Gaza and the West Bank to connect to one another. And we haven't even started talking about the refugee question, which the Palestinians insisted that Israel at least admit some responsibility for the problem. But Israel adamantly opposed to accept any responsibility, even though historians agree, I'm a historian by the way, that Israeli forces expelled tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Palestinians by gunpoint from their homes.
It's amazing to me that the progressives think that they're being progressive by taking that side of it, the Bella Hadids of the world, these influencers. In February of this year, a Hamas court ruled that an unmarried woman cannot travel in Gaza without the permission of a male guardian. Bella Hadid and her friends would run screaming to Tel Aviv if they had to live in Gaza for one day.
Bill, you are absolutely correct. Gaza is unlivable, and that's partially because it's run by a bunch of conservative Islamists. But it's also because of Israel's 13-year-long siege on Gaza, which has turned the Strip into an open-air prison. No one is happy with how the inmates are running the prison from the inside. But that has absolutely nothing to do with Israel's siege, which has blocked all the entry and exit points to and from Israel and the Mediterranean coast. It has meant that 40% of Gaza's population now live in poverty, most of them extreme poverty. 20% of children in Gaza are experiencing stunted growth owing to malnutrition. Between 50 to 90% of the population of Gaza does not have access to safe drinking water. And that is not because of Hamas. That is not because of conservative Islamicism. It is because of the Israeli siege on Gaza, which has made the place unlivable.